if you care about the hardest questions, your use case has very difficult requirements that involves really deep understanding of certain topics or really good reasoning, then that sort of difference could really highlight which kind of models you should be going for versus the ones that perform well on the general ratings. Arena Expert allows us to differentiate between the best models. And the reason why it can do that is that we pick a subset of the most difficult prompts that are written by experts and judged by experts. Instead of looking at the more generic prompts where it's difficult to tell the models apart, if the question is really difficult, then we can see big differences between the models that looked like they were close together, but actually they're much further apart.
Now that you've had a chance to dig into the data, what are your top findings?
The dynamic that I found the most interesting is actually looking at the thinking and non-thinking models. So first of all, as you'd expect, the thinking models generally score better on expert prompts versus the non-thinking models, with some exceptions that we'll get to, but this is the general trend that we're seeing. We can see that the blue dots, they are above the trend line, and if they're above the trend line, that means that they outperform their normal general rating with expert prompts. For some of them, we can really see quite big differences. With Sonnet model 4.5, we see over 50-point difference. With Qwen 3 235B model, we see over 60-point difference. And what that means is that when we look at the hardest prompts, we can actually see that these models do better than maybe on the more general range of prompts. So there are some examples where we can really pick the two versions of the model, where we pick the Sonnet 4.5 thinking versus Sonnet 4.5 non-thinking. If we look at the general rating, they rank very close to each other, so maybe like a few points apart. But actually when we look at the expert version of the leaderboard, there is a gap that emerges, so it becomes 24-point difference in that case. So there are definitely a number of examples where we see that range grow. There are also examples where we see a model that, for example, GPT 5.1 High on the general arena ranks fairly close to ChatGPT 4.0 model, which you can argue is a little bit strange. Why should the two models that have been built like many months apart should rank that close together? But once we filter down to the hardest prompts, then we can see pretty big gap of 50 points emerge. So these are the couple of examples how we can see really good differentiation emerge. We know this from OpenAI themselves in that case, that they were really focusing on reinforcement learning training and really exceeding on the performance of, for example, on scientific prompts, on maths questions, things like that could be a lot harder. And what we know, for example, about ChatGPT 4 model, that it was more optimized for conversational performance and just being nice to talk to. So actually, when you look at the general rankings, you got that mixture of those two different dynamics going on. But then when we just look at the expert ones, we see that 4.0 drops in the points that it gets, while GPT 5.1 goes up versus the general rating, which is a really nice lens to look at and might make more sense to people who look at the rankings and try to work out what's the frontier rather than kind of more general performance. There are some interesting trends by different labs. And we've got a couple of charts here showing the aggregate performance, where, for example, Anthropic models show the uplift of 23 points on average, so that's across all of the models that we looked at here, while DeepSeek, OpenAI, Google have a negative score in here, which gives you a little bit of a feel, but there are many more interesting things to discover. Why do we see this if we go further? We've got another chart which is splitting out these models into the thinking and non-thinking models. And you can see this dynamic where the thinking models really perform quite a bit better across every single company here. So for example, for Anthropic, while all of their models perform better. The thinking ones perform even better. Same for OpenAI, same for Google, same for XAI, Alibaba, and DeepSeek. So this is the trend that we see for every lab. It's also interesting to note for some of them, for OpenAI, Google, XAI, DeepSeek, we see negative numbers for non-thinking models. So what that means is that for the non-thinking models, they actually score lower on average than the thinking models would. It's also interesting to dig further into these trends to really understand what's going on, to really get a sense for that picture. We have grouped together different models into their families. So for example, Opus 4.5, we've got thinking non-thinking together, or for GPT-5, we've got all of that family together, so 6 models in that group. And we've got the aggregate score for them. So if you look at OpenAI, that actually shows us something quite interesting. So for the GPT-5 family of models, or 3 or 4 family of models, we can see really big uplift of 20 points. What that means is that these models do better on the expert score versus the general one. But then if we go further down the list and we look at models like GPT 4.1, GPT 4.5, and then the grouping of GPT-4 and Turbo, what we see is that actually there is quite a big negative score. And you can see how the models that OpenAI has trained more recently, and they focus on that reasoning domain, which GPT-5 or 3 or 4 do, versus the older models such as GPT-4, for example, we can see that really clear divide of OpenAI models getting much better at those expert prompts more recently with reasoning versus what they used to score when they had models like GPT-4, for example. Another interesting dynamic is for Google. While if you look at the aggregate Google score, it doesn't look too good, but if we look at this chart here, we can see quite a big separation between the open source Gemma models, the old Gemini 1.5 and 2 models, again with the more reasoning focused models, with their later models where Google is doing a lot better. So with Gemini 3, 2.5 family of models, we can see big uplifts in that performance, which again really demonstrates the fact that some of them may be older models, so we've got small open source models that really underperform in the expert arena. But then with the later models, they do a lot better.
What does expert advantage mean?
So if it's positive, what that means is that these models perform better on the arena expert versus the general score. If it's negative, that means they perform worse on the expert prompts versus the general.
Why would I ever want to use a model that has an expert disadvantage?
Yeah, so one flip side of that, I guess, could be is that if we look at maybe models that underperform with the experts, but they still get a good general score, it could be that there are some soft advantages that do not really apply in the expert scores. We heard a lot about GPT-4 model and how people love that model, they love to talk to it, which is pretty much the opposite of the expert score and what we're trying to measure there. So that could be an advantage, that if that's the use case that you care about, it could be that there is a way to measure that, and maybe GPT-4 would come out much higher on that kind of metric. But in this case, where we care really about the hardest prompts, there it's a disadvantage.
When it comes to models, would you say that being nice makes you dumb?
Interesting. I think Anthropic models are very nice. They do very well. I think there could be some dynamics, and we are not looking at this necessarily in this blog post, but we could speculate that there are certain things that could make the model rank higher if it's maybe being particularly overly pleasant and trying to please the user a lot, or there's certain things and tricks to kind of get the user to like it more, then maybe it could score high on the general rating. But if you're trying to get legal advice or trying to answer a really hard math problem, being nice doesn't really help that much.
It's not that it's a trade-off between being nice and being smart, but rather being nice helps you have a higher overall score.
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean your capabilities are higher.
Yeah, yeah. I think there could be some examples of that, and I think GPT-4 is probably one where, just based on other evidence as well that we have, we could imagine that maybe it's getting higher general score just because it's a model that people generally like to talk to. But yeah, we can see here we've got good evidence to show that it's actually underperforming on the harder questions, which I think would align with the intuitions of people who actually use that model to deploy it in real applications. And I would guess they're much more likely to use, let's say, if they're OpenAI customer, to use GPT-5 level models rather than GPT-4 model. There are some interesting stories that we can dig into in our head-to-head comparisons. So if we look at xAI's model, we've got the Grok thinking versus Grok non-thinking. They rank pretty closely together on the general rankings, but what we see is that if we look at the Grok 4.1 non-thinking model, it actually drops in the expert ELO score that they get. But when we look at the thinking model, the rating goes up. So then we have a pretty sizable gap of 51 points. So that again shows us that the Grok models do really benefit from thinking for these harder prompts. Another example of this, which is even more stark, is with Qwen 3 thinking and non-thinking. So we've looked at the Qwen 3 235B model and thinking and non-thinking variant. And in here actually, the general score that they got is the thinking model was a tiny bit lower than the non-thinking model, which would sound a little bit odd. Why would that be the case? But when we actually come to look at the expert score, then we see a picture which is something that I would expect to see, is that the thinking benefit is quite a bit higher and on the expert prompts. So we see that the thinking model really surges and gets 66-point advantage versus the non-thinking variant, which is really interesting to see when we look at that dynamic. The last chart here in this section is the Opus 4.5 and the Grok 4.1. So both are the non-thinking models. With Grok, the performance drops, and it actually goes from being slightly above Opus 4.5 to being below Opus 4.5. But then at the same time, Opus 4.5 score really goes up quite a lot. So then we see a really huge gap of 105 points here. This really shows us that once we look at the hardest prompts, at the expert prompts, then we can really differentiate the models. And while they might look maybe on an average general query where we've got a mixture of all sorts of things together in there, it could be that it's a little bit hard to tell the models apart. If you really care about the frontier performance, then you can look at the expert scores and you can see these big gaps emerge.
People just need to ask harder prompts to truly push those models.
Yeah, and it's difficult to find the prompts, especially if you don't have the expertise, or even if you do have expertise in certain area, it could be quite difficult to formulate the prompt and do it yourself. Hence, looking at the expert score is a pretty good way for you to gauge what kind of capability the model has. We've got quite a lot of different dynamics between different labs. If we look at Anthropic, models at the beginning for the earlier models that score lower, such as Haiku 3.5 or even Sonnet 3.5, they didn't really have much of an expert advantage. In fact, they were trending a bit lower. But some of their best performant models right now, towards the right side of that chart, they really go way beyond the trend line that what you'd expect. So the overall takeaway here is that the Anthropic models kept really getting a lot better at the expert prompts, and the general score is maybe not quite even capturing all of the performance gains that the Anthropic models were getting in the more recent times. If we look at the OpenAI models, We've got the lower ranking models there on the left hand side more generally, and apart from them having the lower general score, they also tended to underperform on the expert score even more, so hence they're highlighted in red. Then if we look further, we can see that the reasoning models such as the GPT 5.1 and the higher variants and O3 and O4 mini, there are a bunch of different examples. They are all in the green. So we see the same kind of dynamic of the thinking models doing a lot better. We looked at GPT 4o and that being negative. Another one that stood out to me was the GPT 4.5, which was the bigger model that they released a number of months ago. It actually scored negative on that expert advantage. We can really see the difference that OpenAI models get with reasoning. If we look at the Google models, the same kind of dynamic really emerges in terms of the lower performant models. All the models, the open source models, really have quite dramatically negative scores. But the later models have slight advantage. So with the latest Gemini 3 Pro, it has a fairly modest advantage, but advantage nevertheless of plus 9 points. But we don't see such big uplifts as we saw, for example, with Anthropic models. With XAI, the one interesting dynamic was that some of the earlier thinking models, such as Grok 3 or even Grok 4, had slightly higher advantage versus their very latest iteration. So Grok 4.1, the non-thinking model, has a negative score there, but if we look at the Grok 4, the first iteration of Grok 4, it had a positive one. So that's an interesting dynamic to watch for as they release new models, to see if they actually gain more advantage or there's something going on where they may be getting better in some aspects, but maybe not on that dimension. Something we see that's very interesting is Alibaba models really perform very well on this dimension. So we can see that quite a lot of their models really high above the trend. We can also see some of the smaller models, such as the Quant 3 32B, the thinking, non-thinking, or 30B, A3B models as well. Quite a lot of their models across the spectrum perform better on the expert scores versus the general one, which is really interesting dynamic that I not necessarily would have assumed that would be the case. And it could signal that we are even slightly underestimating the Alibaba models if we look at the more general benchmarks, or maybe a bunch of different other benchmarks that are not necessarily looking at the hardest questions and the frontier. When we look at DeepSeek models, all of their models are open source, and it's interesting to look into the dynamics there. They're not quite as clear as with some of the other labs. So we see that the big important model of V3, for example, has a slight disadvantage. The R1 model is pretty much on the trend line. It has -1 point, but that's pretty much spot on. But some of the later models, it's a bit more mixed. There are some negative, there are some positives. In the later ones, such as 3.1, and we've got the 3.2 experimental version there is a slight advantage. But there is not quite as such clear trend as we see, for example, with WAN models. The best thing you can do if you're really interested in looking at the frontier of the models, you should really look at the expert leaderboards that we have. They really give you much better sense for what kind of models are right at the frontier.